Wait here. What Tempe has done is not good. I will listen. Then I will decide what is to be done with you. I nodded, and she closed the door behind her. I waited for an hour, then 2. I strained my ears, but I couldn't hear anything from the other side of the door. A few people walked past in the hallway. 2 in mercenary reds, and another in simple gray homespun. Each of them looked at my hair, though none of them stared. Instead of smiling and nodding, as would have been sociable among barbarians, I kept my face blank, returned their small gestures of greeting, and avoided touching eyes. Somewhere past the 3rd hour, the door opened, and Cheyenne waved me inside. It was a well-lit room with walls of finished stone. It was the size of a large bedroom at an inn, but seemed even larger due to the lack of any significant furniture. There was a small iron stove radiating gentle heat near one wall, and 4 chairs facing each other in a rough circle. Tempe, Cheyenne, and Carceret filled 3 of them. At a gesture from Cheyenne, I took the 4th. "How many have you killed?" Cheyenne asked.
What?
Her tone was different than before. Peremptory.
I'm not getting into my
It was the same tone Tempe used during our discussions of the Lethani. "Many," I responded, without any hesitation. I might be thick at times, but I know when I'm being tested. "How many is many?" Not a request for clarification. It was a new question.
You cannot tell me that you haven't done
In killing men, 1 is many.
After you're dumb.
She nodded slightly.
I said that? Or like,
Have you killed men outside of the Lethani? Perhaps.
Like that happened?
Why do you not say yes or no? Because the Lethani has not always been clear to me. And why is that?
No,
Because the Lethani is not always clear. What makes the Lethani clear? I hesitated, though I knew it wasn't the right thing to do. The words of a teacher. Can one teach the Lethani? I began to gesture uncertainty, then remembered hand talk wasn't appropriate. Perhaps, I said.
It's not my thing.
I cannot.
What's wrong with feet? Listen.
Tempe shifted slightly in his chair. This wasn't going well. For lack of any other ideas, I took a deep breath, relaxed, and tipped my mind gently into spinning leaf. Who knows the Lethani? Cheyenne asked. The wind-blown leaf, I responded, though I cannot honestly say what I meant by it.
It's normal to some people.
Where does the Lethani come from? The same place as laughing. Cheyenne hesitated slightly, then asked, How do you follow the Lethani? How do you follow the moon? My time with Tempe had taught me to appreciate the different sorts of pauses that can punctuate a conversation. Ademic is a language that says as much with silence as with words. There is a pregnant pause, a polite pause, a confused pause. There is a pause that implies much, a pause that apologizes, a pause that adds emphasis. This pause was a sudden gape in the conversation. It was the empty space of an indrawn breath. I sensed I had said something very clever or something very stupid. Cheyenne shifted in her seat, and the air of formality evaporated. Sensing we were moving on, I let my mind settle out of spinning leaf. Cheyenne turned to look at Carceret. What do you say? Carceret had sat like a statue through all of this, expressionless and still. I say as I have said before, Tempe has not denied us all. He should be cut away. This is the reason we have laws. To ignore a law is to erase it. To blindly follow law is to be a slave, Tempe said quickly. Cheyenne gestured, sharp rebuke, and Tempe flushed with embarrassment. As for this, Carceret gestured at me. Dismissal. He is not of Edemre. At best, he is a fool. At worst, a liar and a thief.
Dude, Trippy, I'm telling you, man, the last thing that I'm thinking about...
And what he said today? Cheyenne asked. A dog can bark 3 times without counting. Cheyenne turned to Tempe.
We were first
By speaking out of turn, you refuse your turn to speak. Tempe flushed again, his lips growing pale as he struggled to maintain his composure. Cheyenne drew a deep breath and let it out slowly. "The K-10 and the Letani are what make us Edemre," she said. "There is no way a barbarian can know of the K-10. Both Tempe and Carceret stirred, but she held up a hand. "At the same time, to destroy one who has understanding of the Letani is not correct.
It's true.
The Letani does not destroy itself."
It's different than...
She said destroy very casually.
Oh my God, that's feet.
I hoped I might be mistaken as to the true meaning of the Ademic word. Cheyenne continued. "There are those who might say, this one has enough. Do not teach him the Letani, because whoever has knowledge of the Letani overcomes all things."
Nook and cranny?
Cheyenne gave a severe look to Carceret. "But I am not one who would say that.
I don't know.
I think the world would be better if more were of the Letani. For while it brings power, the Letani also brings wisdom in the use of power." There was a long pause. My stomach knotted itself as I tried to maintain a calm appearance.
No.
"I think," Cheyenne said at last,
No.
"it is possible Tempe did not make a mistake." This seemed a long way from a ringing endorsement, but from the sudden stiffness in Carceret's back and Tempe's slow, relieved exhalation, I guessed it was the news we were hoping for. "I will give him to Vacher,"
Yes.
Cheyenne said. Tempe went motionless. Carceret made a gesture of approval, wide as a madman's smile. Tempe's voice was strained. "You will give him to the hammer."
Your toes, you know?
His hand flickered. Respect. Negation. Respect. Cheyenne got to her feet, signaling an end to the discussion. "Who better? The hammer will show if he is iron worth striking." With this, Cheyenne pulled Tempe aside and spoke to him for a brief moment. Her hands brushed his arms lightly. Her voice was too soft for even my finely tuned eavesdropper's ears. I stood politely near my chair. All the fight seemed to have left Tempe, and his gestures were a steady rhythm of agreement and respect. Carceret stood apart from them as well, staring at me.
Ticklish?
Her expression was composed, but her eyes were angry. At her side, out of sight of the other two, she made several small gestures. The only one I understood was disgust, but I could guess the general meaning of the others. In return, I made a gesture that was not Ademic. By the narrowing of her eyes, I suspected she managed to glean my meaning fairly well. There was the high sound of a bell ringing 3 times. A moment later, Tempe kissed Cheyenne's hands, the peak of her forehead and her mouth. Then he turned and motioned for me to follow. Together we walked to a large, low-ceilinged room filled with people and the smell of food. It was a dining hall, full of long tables and dark wooden benches worn smooth with time. I followed Tempe, gathering food onto a wide wooden plate. Only then did I realize how terribly hungry I was. Despite my expectations, this dining hall didn't resemble the mess at the university in the least. It was quieter, for one thing, and the food was far better. There was fresh milk and lean, tender meat that I suspected was goat. There was hard, sharp cheese and soft, creamy cheese, and 2 kinds of bread still warm from the oven. There were apples and strawberries for the taking. Salt boxes sat open on all the tables, and everyone could take as much as they liked. It was strange being in a room full of Adem talking. They spoke so softly I couldn't make out any words, but I could see their hands flickering. I could only understand 1 gesture in 10, but it was odd being able to see all the flickering emotions around me. Amusement, anger, embarrassment, negation, disgust. I wondered how much of it was about me, the barbarian among them. There were more women than I'd expected, and more young children. There were a handful of the familiar blood-red mercenaries, but more wore the simple gray I'd seen during my walk with Cheyenne.
So hard to counter.
I saw a white shirt as well, and was surprised to see it was Cheyenne herself, eating elbow to elbow with the rest of us. None of them stared at me, but they were looking. A lot of attention was being paid to my hair, which was understandable. There were 50 sandy heads in the room, a few darker, a few lighter or gray with age. I stood out like a single burning candle. I tried to draw Tempe into a conversation, but he would have none of it and focused on his food instead. He hadn't loaded his plate nearly as full as mine and ate only a fraction of what he took. With no conversation to slow things, I finished quickly. When my plate was empty, Tempe quit pretending to eat and led us away.
Stupid, bro.
I could feel dozens of eyes on my back as we left the room. He took me down a series of passages until we came to a door. Tempe opened it, revealing a small room with a window and a bed. My loot and travel sack were there. My sword was not.
You are to have another teacher, Tempe spoke at last. Do your best. Be civilized. Your teacher will decide much.
Regret.
You will not see me.
He was obviously troubled, but I couldn't think of anything to say that might reassure him. Instead, I gave him a comforting hug, which he seemed to appreciate. Then he turned and left without another word. Inside my room, I undressed and lay on the bed. It seems like I should say I tossed and turned, nervous about what was to come. But the simple truth is that I was exhausted and slept like a happy baby at his mother's breast. Chapter 112. The Hammer. I sat in a tiny park composed of nothing more than 2 smooth stone benches, a handful of trees, and a small path running through the long grass. You could walk from one edge to the other in a minute. There were cliffs close on 2 sides, sheltering it from the wind. Not out of the wind, mind you.
What the fuck am I
There didn't
playing?
seem to be anywhere in all of Hert entirely out of the wind. As Vachette approached, the first thing I noticed was that she didn't wear her sword on her hip.
Oh, it's just feet, man. It's
Instead,
just feet. It's
she
just feet.
slung it over her shoulder, just as I carried my loot. She walked with the most subtle, solid confidence I have ever seen, as if she knew she ought to swagger, but couldn't quite be bothered. She had the same moderate build I'd come to expect from the Adem, along with the pale, creamy complexion and gray eyes. Her hair was lighter than Tempe's by a fine shade, and she wore it pulled back into a horsetail. When she came closer, I could see her nose had been broken at some point, and while it wasn't crooked, the slight crimp looked strangely incongruous on her otherwise delicate face. Vachette smiled at me, a wide pink smile that showed her white teeth. "So," she said in flawless Aturan, "you are mine now." "You speak Aturan," I said stupidly. "Most of us do," she said. There were a few lines around the mouth and the corners of her eyes, so I guessed she was perhaps 10 years older than me. "It's hard to make your way in the world if you don't have a good grip on the language. Hard to do business." I remembered myself too late. Formal, respect. "Am I correct in assuming you are Vachette?" The smile tugged back onto her mouth. Vachette returned my gesture broadly, exaggerating it so I couldn't help but feel I was being mocked. "I am. I am to be your teacher."
Or maybe they're just saying
"What of Cheyenne?" I understood she was the teacher here. Vachette arched an eyebrow at me, the extravagant expression startling on an Adem face. "In a general sense, that is true, but in a more practical sense, Cheyenne is far too important to be spending her time with someone like you."
Oh, yeah, no.
I gestured,
I don't
polite.
my toes suck.
I was quite happy with Tempe,
They just be
I said.
happen.
"And if your happiness were our goal, that might matter," she said. "However, Tempe is closer to being a sailboat than a teacher." I bristled a little at that. "He is my friend, you realize." Her eyes narrowed. "Then as his friend, you may fail to realize his faults. He is a competent fighter, but no more than that. He barely speaks your language, has little experience with the real world, and, to be completely frank, he is not terribly bright." "I'm sorry," I said. Regret. "I didn't mean to offend you." "Don't show me humility unless you mean it," she said, still looking me over with narrow eyes. Even when you make your face a mask, your eyes are like glittering windows. I am sorry, I said earnestly. Apology. I'd hoped to make a good first impression. Why? She asked. I would rather you thought well of me. I would rather have reason to think well of you. I decided to take another tack, hoping to steer the conversation into safer water. Tempe called you the Hammer.
One burst.
Why is that? That is my name. Vachette. The hammer, the clay, the spinning wheel. She pronounced her name 3 separate ways, each with its own cadence. I am that which shapes and sharpens, or destroys. Why the clay? That is also what I
That's
am,
what I'm saying.
Vachette
I swear to
said.
God, that, like...
Only that which bends can teach.
No, bro, this toe shit is new.
I felt a
This
growing
toe shit is
excitement
new, I
as she
swear to God.
spoke. I will admit, I said, it will be pleasant to share a language with my
This toe
teacher.
shit's new.
There are 1,000 questions I have not asked because I knew Tempe could not understand. Or, even if he did, I wouldn't be able to make sense of his answers. Vachette nodded and sat down on one of the benches. Knowing how to communicate is also the way of a teacher, she said. Now, go find a long piece of wood and bring it back to me. Then, we will begin the lesson. I headed off into the trees. Her request had a ritual air about it, so I didn't want to run back with any odd branch I found on the ground. Eventually, I found a willow tree and snapped off a supple branch longer than my arm and big around as my little finger. I returned to where Vachette sat on the bench. I handed her the willow branch, and she pulled her sword over her shoulder and began to trim the smaller nubs of the remaining branches away. You said, only that which bends can teach, I said. So, I thought this would be appropriate.
The only languages I
It
know.
will serve for today's lesson, she said as she stripped the last of the bark away, leaving nothing but a slender white rod. She wiped her sword on her shirt, sheathed it, and came to her feet.
That I know are just like I only know swear words.
Holding the willow branch in one hand, Vachette swung it back and forth, making a low whop, whop noise as it skimmed through the air. Now that she was closer to me, I noticed that while Vachette wore the familiar mercenary reds, unlike Tempe and many of the others, her clothes weren't held tight with leather straps. Her shirt and pants were bound snugly to her arms and legs and chest by bands of blood-red silk instead. She met my eye. I am going to hit you now, she said seriously. Stand still. Vachette began to walk around me in a slow circle, still swinging the willow rod. Whop, whop. She moved behind me, and not being able to see her was worse. Whop, whop. She swung the rod faster, and the noise changed. Vip, vip. I didn't flinch. She circled again, moved behind me, then hit me twice. Once on each arm, just below the shoulder. Vip, vip. At first, it merely felt like she'd tapped me. Then pain blossomed across my arms, blazing like fire. Then, before I could react, she struck me across the back so hard I felt the impact in my teeth. The only reason the rod didn't break is because it was supple green willow. I didn't cry out, but only because she had caught me between breaths. I gasped, though, sucking in air so quickly I choked and coughed. My back screamed with pain as if it had been set afire. She came around to the front of me again, giving me that same serious look. Here is your lesson, she said matter-of-factly. I do not think well of you. You are a barbarian. You are not clever. You are not welcome. You do not belong here. You are a thief of our secrets. Your presence is an embarrassment and a complication this school does not need. Vachette contemplated the end of the willow rod, then turned her eyes back to me. We will meet here again, an hour after lunch. You will pick another stick, and I will try to teach you this lesson again. She gave me a pointed look. If the stick you bring me does not please me, I will choose my own. We will do the same after dinner. Then the same the next day. This is the only lesson I have to teach you. When you learn it, you will leave Hert and never return. She looked at me, her face cool. Do you understand? What will... Her hand flicked out, and the tip of the rod caught me on the cheek. This time, I had the breath for it, and gave a high, startled yelp. Vachette looked at me. I'd never thought anything so simple as eye contact could be so intimidating, but her pale gray eyes were hard as ice. Say to me, yes, Vachette, I understand. I glared. Yes, Vachette, I understand. The right side of my upper lip felt huge and unwieldy as I spoke.
Dude, I've had this conversation.
She searched
before.
my
I'm not a
face
big
as if
booty
trying to
person. I
decide
like
something,
booties, don't get
then
me wrong.
shrugged and tossed the stick
But I'm
aside.
not like a big booty, like a big body.
Only
person.
then did I risk speaking again.
I'm shape oversized.
What would happen to Tempe if I were to leave?
I'm a shape oversized person.
When you leave,
I'm a shape
she said,
oversized
stressing the
person.
first word. The few that
big.
doubt it
You know what I'm
will
saying?
know he was wrong to teach you,
That ain't for me.
doubly wrong to bring
That
you
ain't for
here.
me.
And what will... I paused and backtracked. What would become of him in that case? She shrugged and turned away. That is not for me to decide, she said, and walked away. I touched my cheek
Dude,
and lip,
I'm getting
then
fucking
looked at my
railed,
hand.
Bro. Did they forget
No
that
blood,
they were fighting each other?
but I could feel the red welt rising on my skin, plain as a brand for anyone to see. Not sure what else I should do, I returned to the school for lunch. After making my way to the dining hall, I looked around but didn't see
fuck?
Tempe among the blood-red mercenaries there. I was glad for that. As much as I would have enjoyed some friendly company, I couldn't bear the thought of him knowing how badly
God.
things had gone. I wouldn't even need to tell him. The mark on my face said it plainly for everyone in the room to see. I kept my face impassive and my eyes low as I moved through the line and filled my plate. Then I chose an empty section of table, not wanting to force my company on anyone. I have been alone for most of my life,
Just admit you can't
but
handle it. It's
rarely
not
have
that
I
can't
felt it
handle
so
I
much as
just-
at that
I don't know,
moment.
man.
I knew one person within 400 miles, and he'd been ordered to keep away from me.
Like a summer ray, like
I was unfamiliar with the culture, barely competent with the language, and the burning all across my back and face was a constant reminder of how much I was unwelcome.
like a black. Oh shit!
The food was good,
Bro,
though.
this guy just fucking
Roasted
just been
chicken,
railing
crisp
me
long beans,
left, right,
and a
center.
slice of sweet molasses pudding. Better fare than I could usually afford for myself at the university, and hotter than the food at the mayor's estate.
Bro, I've not
I
been
wasn't
looking at my fucking
particularly
streams.
hungry,
You guys
but I've been
fucking
hungry
me
enough
up.
in my life that I have a hard time walking
like a
away
Black
from an
China?
easy meal.
Hell no.
There was a shadow of movement on the edge of my vision as someone sat down across the table from me. I felt my mood lighten. At least one person was brave enough to visit the barbarian. Someone was kind enough to comfort me, or at least curious enough to come and talk. Lifting my head, I saw Carceret's lean, scarred face. She set her wide wooden plate down across from me. "How do you like our town?" she said quietly, her left hand resting on the surface of the table. Her gestures were different as we were sitting, but I could still recognize curious and polite. To anyone watching, it would seem like we were having a pleasant conversation. "How do you like your new teacher?" "She thinks as I think, that you do not belong." I chewed another mouthful of chicken and swallowed mechanically, not looking up. Concern. "I heard you cry out," she continued softly. She spoke slower now, as if talking to a child. I wasn't sure if it was meant to be an insult or to ensure I understood her. "It was like a tiny bird." I took a drink of warm goat's milk and wiped my mouth. The motion of my arm pulled my shirt across the welt on my back, stinging like 100 wasps. "Was it the cry of love?" she asked, making a gesture I didn't recognize. "Did Vachette embrace you? Does your cheek bear the mark of her tongue?" I took a bit of pudding. It wasn't as sweet as I remembered. Carceret took a bite of her own pudding. "Everyone gambles, and then you will leave," she continued, still speaking slow and low for my ears only. "I have 2 talents wagered that you will not last the second day. If you leave in the night, as I hope, I win silver.
Would you ever
If
fly
I
them?
am wrong and you stay, I win in bruises and listening to your cries. Entreaty. Stay." I looked up at her. "You speak as a dog barks," I said, "with no end, with no sense." I spoke quietly enough to be polite, but not so quietly that my voice didn't reach the ears of everyone sitting close to us. I know how to make a soft voice carry. Wee Roo invented the stage whisper. I saw her face flush, making the pale scars on her jaw and eyebrow stand out. I looked down and continued to eat, the very picture of calm unconcern. It's tricky, insulting someone from a different culture, but I'd chosen my words carefully based on things I'd heard Tempe say. If she responded in any way, it would only seem to prove my point.
There's no way that guy was just sitting there.
I finished the rest of my meal slowly and methodically, imagining I could feel the rage rolling off her like waves of heat.
Supermodel shit?
This small battle, at least, I could win. It was a hollow victory, of course, but sometimes you have to take what you can get.
Really greedy, but yeah.
When Vachette returned to the small park, I was already sitting on one of the stone benches, waiting for her. She stood before me and sighed gustily. "Lovely. A slow learner," she said in her perfect Aturan. "Go fetch your stick, then. We'll see if I can make my point more clearly this time." "I've already found my stick," I said.
Low-key,
I reached behind the bench and brought out a wooden training sword I'd borrowed from the school. It was old, oiled wood, worn smooth by countless hands, hard and heavy as a bar of iron. If she used this to strike my shoulders as she had with the willow rod, it would break bones. If she struck my face, it would shatter my jaw. I set it on the bench beside me. The wood didn't clatter against the stone. It was so hard it almost rang like a bell. After I set down the training sword, I began to pull my shirt up over my head, sucking a breath through my teeth when it dragged against the hot welt on my back. "Are you hoping to sway me with the offer of your tender young body?" Vachette asked.
Wouldn't be surprised if she got
"You're
like a brow
pretty,
lift
but
or like
not
a
so pretty as that."
fat reduction in her face.
I laid my shirt carefully on the bench. "I just thought it would be best if I showed you something." I turned so she could see my back. "You've been whipped," she said. "I cannot say I'm surprised.
I mean, here's the thing.
I
though,
already
if you
knew
saw, like,
you to
picture
be
of
a
Kendall when she
thief.
was young,
These are
Kinda
not
looks-
from thieving," I said. "These are from the university. I was brought up on charges and sentenced to be whipped.
Like you could
When
be
this
like,
happens,
okay,
many students simply leave and take their education elsewhere.
like, you know,
I decided to stay.
if you see a picture of
It was
like,
only
Kim
3
K or,
lashes
like,
after all. I waited, still facing
like,
away.
fucking anyone that's
After a moment, she took
from
the
that
bait.
fucking family,
"There are more scars here than 3 lashes can account for."
you won't be able to recognize them.
Sometime after that, I said,
We're literally
I was brought up
unrecognizable.
on charges again. 6 lashes this time. Still, I stayed. I turned back to face her. I stayed because there was no other place I could learn what I desired. Mere whipping could not keep me away from it. I picked up the heavy wooden sword from the bench. "I thought it only fair that you should know this. I cannot be frightened away with the threat of pain. I will not abandon Tempe after the trust he has shown me. There are things I desire to learn, and I can only learn them here." I handed her the hard, dark piece of wood. "If you want me to leave, you must do worse than welts." I stepped back and let my hands hang at my sides. I closed my eyes. Chapter 113, Barbarian Tongue. I'd like to say I kept my eyes closed, but that wouldn't be the truth. I heard the gritty sound of dirt beneath the soles of Vachette's shoes, and couldn't help but open them. I didn't peek. That would only make me seem childish.
No work.
I simply opened my eyes and looked at her. She stared back, making more eye contact than I would get from Tempe in a span of days.
Anything.
Her pale gray eyes were hard in her delicate face. Her broken nose no longer looked out of place. It was a grim warning to the world. The wind swirled between us, raising gooseflesh on my naked arms. Vachette drew a resigned breath and shrugged, then flipped the wooden rod to grip the handle end. She hefted it thoughtfully with both hands, getting a feel for its weight. Then she brought it up to her shoulder and swung. Except she didn't. "Fine," she said, exasperated, throwing up her hands. "You twiggy little skeeth. Fine. Shit and onions. Put your shirt back on. You're making me cold." I sank down until I was sitting on the bench.
You know how,
"Thank God," I said. I started to put my shirt back on, but it was difficult as my hands were shaking. It wasn't from the cold. Vachette saw. "I knew it," she said triumphantly, pointing a finger at me. "You standing there like you're ready to be hanged. I knew you were ready to run like a rabbit." She stamped her foot in frustration. "I knew I should have taken a swing at you." "I'm glad you didn't," I said. I managed to get my shirt on, then realized it was inside out. I decided to leave it rather than drag it across my stinging back again. "What gave me away?" she demanded. "Nothing," I said. "It was a masterful performance." "Then how do you know I wasn't going to crack your skull open?" "I thought it through," I said. "If Cheyenne had really wanted me driven off, she could have just sent me packing. If she wanted me dead, she could have done that too." I rubbed my sweaty hands on my pants. "That meant you were really meant to be my teacher, so there were only 3 sensible options." I held up a finger. "This was a ritual initiation," a second finger. "It was test of my resolve,"
Probably ask.
"or I was really trying to run you off," Vachette finished as she sat on the bench opposite me. "What if I'd been telling the truth and thumped you bloody?" I shrugged. "At least I'd have known. But it seemed like long odds that Cheyenne would choose someone like that. If she'd wanted me beaten, she could have let Carceret do it." I cocked my head. "Out of curiosity, which was it? Initiation or test of resolve? Does everyone go through this?" She shook her head.
I could volunteer
for Resolve. "I needed to make sure of you. I wasn't going to waste my time teaching a coward or someone afraid of a little smack or two. I also needed to know you were dedicated." I nodded. That seemed the most likely. I thought I'd save myself several days of welts and force the issue. Vachette gave me a long look, curiosity plain on her face. "I will admit, I've never had a student offer himself up for a vicious beating in order to prove he's worth my time." "This was nothing," I said nonchalantly. "Once, I jumped off a roof." We spent an hour talking about small things, letting the tension between us slowly bleed away. She asked how exactly I'd come to be whipped, and I gave her the bones of the story, glad to have the chance to explain myself. I didn't want her thinking of me as a criminal. Vachette examined my scars more closely afterward. "Whoever tended to you certainly knew their physic," she said admiringly. "This is very clean work. As good as any I've ever seen." "I'll pass along your compliments," I said. Her hand brushed gently along the edge of the hot welt that ran across the whole length of my back. "I'm sorry for this, by the way. It hurts worse than the whipping ever did, I'll tell you that for free." "It'll be gone in a day or two," she said, "which isn't to say you won't be sleeping on your stomach tonight." She helped me settle my shirt, then moved back to the other bench facing me. I hesitated before saying, "No offense, Vachette, but you seem different from the other ADEM I've met. Not that I've met many, mind you." "You're just hungry for familiar body language," she said. "There is that," I said. "But you seem more expressive than the other ADEM I've seen." I pointed at my face.
70, 80.
Vachette shrugged. Where I'm from, we grow up speaking your
Put him on the
language.
street, bro. I can't remember the last
And I
time
spent
talked
4
about
years as bodyguard and captain for a poet
Am I
in the
still red?
small
I am still
kingdoms who also happened to be a king. I probably
Every time,
speak
man.
a Turan better than anyone in
it.
Herd, including you. I ignored the last. You didn't grow up here? She shook her head. I'm from Fayent, a town farther north. We're more cosmopolitan. Hert only has the one school, and everyone is tied very tightly to it. The sword tree is one of the old paths, too. Rather formal. I grew up following the path of joy. There are other schools?
Once you're 2/3
Bashat
into
nodded.
the average lifespan, then you'll be.
This is one of the many schools that follow the Latanta, the path of the sword tree. It's one of the oldest behind the 8th and
What is the
Eratan.
average expected lifespan?
There are other paths,
Like
maybe
90s?
3 dozen,
Like most people I know,
but some of those are very
they're
small,
like
with
90s.
only 1 or 2 schools teaching their K-10. Is that why your sword is different? I asked. Did you bring it from your other school? Bashat
Exactly,
gave
like,
me
you're
a
not
narrow
worried
look.
about looking good or looking
What
like
do
shit
you
when
know
you're
of my sword?
old, you know?
You brought it out to trim the willow switch, I said. Tempe's sword was well made, but
You ain't putting
yours
on a
is
dress and
different.
Going to the club, you know?
The handle is worn, but the blade looks new.
You don't give a
She
fuck.
gave me a curious look.
You go into the grocery store.
Well,
in
you
pajamas.
certainly have your eyes open, don't you? I shrugged. Strictly
At that age, you
speaking, it's
understand
not
that you
my
look like
sword,
shit.
Bashat said.
There ain't no
It's
saving.
merely in my keeping. It is an old sword. The blade is the oldest part of it. It
Well,
was
they
given
close
to
the
me
rails,
by
too.
Cheyenne herself. Is that why you
Like,
came
I
to this
understand
school?
That I look like shit right
Bashat
now.
shook her head.
I'll go.
No.
Oh shit.
Cheyenne gave me the sword
I'll go
much
to the fucking
later.
grocery store and some
She
fucking
reached back
pajamas.
and touched the hilt fondly. No. I came here because while the Latanta might be rather formal, they excel in the use of the sword. I had learned as much as I could from the Path of Joy. 3 other schools refused me before Cheyenne brought me in. She's a clever woman and realized there was something to be gained in teaching me. I guess we're both lucky she has an open mind, I said. You more than me, Bashat said. There's a certain amount of one-upsmanship among the different paths. When I joined the Latanta, it was a bit of a feather in Cheyenne's cap. It must have been hard, I said, coming here and being the stranger to everyone. Bashat shrugged, making her sword rise and fall on her shoulder. At first, she admitted. But they recognize talent, and I have that to spare. Among those who study the Path of Joy, I was viewed as rather stiff and stodgy. But here, I'm seen as somewhat wild. She grinned. It's pleasant, like having a new set of clothes to wear. Does the Path of Joy also teach the Lethani? I asked. Bashat laughed. That is a matter of some considerable debate. The simple answer is yes. All Adem study the Lethani to some degree, those in the schools especially. That said,
This
the
game,
Lethani is
I
open
didn't
to
know
a
audio
broad
like 4 times
interpretation.
already.
What some
I didn't
schools
hear that
cling
guy.
to,
I didn't
others
hear the other
spurn.
guy. I didn't hear the other guy.
She gave me a thoughtful look. Is it true you said the Lethani comes from the same places, laughing?
Okay, but the thing about
I nodded.
Jennifer Aniston is that she definitely
That is a good answer, she said. My
cares a
teacher
lot
in the
about her
Path of
appearance.
Joy once said that very thing
She's
to
got
me.
a lot of money and a lot
Bashat
of time.
frowned.
So
You look pensive when I
she
say
probably
that.
does like a long
Why?
list of things every single day to make sure
I'd
that
tell
she
you,
doesn't age
I said,
a lot. You know,
but I don't want you to think less of me.
You're probably eating all
I
the
think
good
less
food.
of you for keeping something from
You
your
know what I'm saying?
teacher, she
Fucking
said
16
seriously.
creams.
There must be trust between us. I sighed.
You probably just be like, don't touch
I'm
me
glad
in
you
my
like
face.
my answer.
Don't touch this.
But honestly, I don't know what it means. I didn't ask you what it means, she said easily.
Sylvester Stallone, he looks old.
It's just a nonsense
Sylvester
answer,
Stallone
I
looks
said.
old. He looks like
I know
shit.
you all place great stock in the
keep it up.
Lethani, but I don't really understand it. I've just found a way to fake it. Bashat smiled indulgently.
Like this.
There is no pretending to understand the Lethani, she said confidently. It is like swimming. It is obvious to anyone watching if you really know the way of it.
Stallone looks like shit.
A person can pretend to swim, too, I pointed out. I've simply been moving my arms and walking on the bottom of the river. She gave me a curious look. Very well, then. How have you managed to fool us? I explained Spinning Leaf to her. How I had learned to tip my thoughts into a light, empty, floating place where the answers to their questions came easily. So, you have stolen the answers from yourself, she said with mock seriousness. You have cleverly fooled us by pulling the answers from your own mind. You don't understand, I said, growing irritated. I don't have the slightest idea what the Lethani really is. It's not a path, but it helps choose a path. It's the simplest way, but it is not easy to see. Honestly, you people sound like drunk cartographers. I regretted saying it as soon as it was out of my mouth, but Vachette merely laughed. There are many drunks who are quite conversant with the Lethani, she said. Several legendarily so. Seeing I was still agitated, she made a motion to calm me. I don't understand the Lethani either, not in a way that can be explained to another. The teaching of the Lethani is an art I do not possess. If Tempi has managed to instill the Lethani in you, it is a great mark in his favor. Vachette leaned forward seriously. Part of the problem is with your language, she said. A Turan is very explicit. It is very precise and direct. Our language is rich with implication, so it is easier for us to accept the existence of things that cannot be explained. The Lethani is the greatest of these.
I'm gonna be honest.
Can you give me an example of one other than the Lethani? I asked. And please don't say blue, or I might go absolutely mad right here on this bench.
She definitely looked good.
She thought for a moment. Love is such a thing. You have knowledge of what it is, but it defies careful explication. Love is a subtle concept, I admitted. It's elusive, like justice, but it can be defined. Her eyes sparkled.
Me too.
Do so then, my clever student. Tell me of love.
And Adriana Lima
I thought for a quick moment, then for a long moment. Vachette grinned.
And I feel like every guy wins.
You see how easy it will be for me to pick holes in any definition you give. Love is the willingness to do anything for someone, I said, even at detriment to yourself. In that case, she said, how is love different from duty or loyalty? It is also combined with a physical attraction, I said. Even a mother's love? Vachette asked. Combined with an extreme fondness, then, I amended. And what exactly do you mean by fondness? She asked with a maddening calm. It is... I trailed off, racking my brain to think how I could describe love without resorting to other equally abstract terms. This is the nature of love, Vachette said. To attempt to describe it will drive a woman mad. That is what keeps poets scribbling endlessly away. If one could pin it to the paper, all complete, the others would lay down their pens. But it cannot be done. She held up a finger. But only a fool claims there is no such thing as love. When you see two young ones staring at each other with dewy eyes, there it is, so thick you can spread it on your bread and eat it. When you see a mother with her child, you see love. When you feel it roil in your belly, you know what it is, even if you cannot give voice to it in words. Vachette made a triumphant gesture. Thus also is the Lethani. But as it is greater, it is more difficult to point toward. That is the purpose of the questions. Asking them is like asking a young girl about the boy she fancies. Her answers may not use the word, but they reveal love, or the lack of it within her heart.
You want me to start thinking about men?
How can my answers reveal a knowledge of the Lethani when I don't truly know what it is? I asked. You obviously understand the Lethani, she said. It is rooted deep inside you. Too deep for you to see. Sometimes it is the same with love. Vachette reached out and tapped me on the forehead. As for this spinning leaf, I have heard of similar things practiced by other paths. There is no Aturan word for it that I know. It is like a K-10 for your mind, a motion you make with your thoughts to train them. She made a dismissive gesture. Either way, it is not cheating. It is a way of revealing that which is hidden in the deep waters of your mind. The fact that you found it on your own is quite remarkable. I nodded to her. I bow to your wisdom, Vashet. You bow to the fact that I am unarguably correct. She clapped her hands together. Now, I have much to teach you. However, as you are still welted and flinching, let us forbear the K-10. Show me your Adamic instead. I want to hear you wound my lovely language with your rough barbarian tongue.
How did I just insta-switch guns?
I learned a great deal about Adamic over the next several hours. It was refreshing to be able to ask detailed questions and receive clear, specific answers in return. After a month of dancing about and drawing in the dirt, learning from Vashet was so easy it felt dishonest. On the other hand, Vashet made it clear that my hand language was embarrassingly crude. I could get my point across, but what I was doing was, at best, baby talk. At worst, it resembled the rantings of a deranged maniac. Right now, you speak like this. She got to her feet, waved both hands over her head, and pointed to herself with both thumbs. I want to make good fight. She gave a wide, insipid grin. With sword. She thumped her chest with both fists, then jumped into the air like an excited child. Come now, I said, embarrassed. I'm not that bad. You are close, Vashet said seriously as she sat back down on the bench. If you were my son, I would not let you leave the house. As my student, it is only tolerable because you are a barbarian. It's as if Tempi brought home a dog that can whistle. The fact that you are out of tune stands quite beside the point. Vashet made as if she would get to her feet. That said, if you are happy speaking like a simpleton, just say the word and we can move to other things. I reassured her I wanted to learn.
You're probably looking at like
First, you say too much, and you speak too loudly, she said. The heart of Adem is stillness and silence. Our language reflects this. Second, you must be much more careful with your gestures, she said, with their placement and timing. They modify specific words and thoughts. They do not always reinforce what you say. Sometimes they run purposely counter to your surface meaning. She made 7 or 8 different gestures in quick succession. All of them said amusement, but each of them was slightly different. You must also come to understand the fine shades of meaning. The difference between slim and slender, as my poet king used to say.
I don't know, I haven't seen that movie in a
Right
really long
now,
time.
you only have one smile, and that cannot help but make a person look a fool. We worked for several hours, and Vashet made clear something Tempi could only hint at. A Turin was like a wide, shallow pool. It had many words, all very specific and precise. Ademic was like a deep well. There were fewer words, but they each had many meanings. A well-spoken sentence in a Turin is a straight line pointing. A well-spoken sentence in a Dem is like a spider web, each strand with a meaning of its own, a piece of something greater, more complex. I arrived in the dining hall for supper in a considerably better mood than before. My welts still stung, but my fingers told me the swelling on my cheek was much reduced. I still sat alone, but I didn't keep my head down as I had before. Instead, I watched the hands of everyone around me, trying to note the subtle shades of difference between excitement and interest, between denial and refusal. After supper, Vashet brought a small pot of salve which she smeared liberally across my back and upper arms, then more sparingly on my face. It tingled at first, then burned, then settled down to a dull, numb heat. Only after the pain along my back faded did I realize how tense my entire body had been. There, Vashet said, twisting the stopper back into the bottle. How is that? I could kiss you, I said gratefully. You could, she said, but your lip is swollen and you would doubtless make a mess of it. Instead, show me your K-10. I hadn't stretched,
That's a
but not
fucking
wanting
shark,
to make
please.
excuses, I fell into open hands
There's
and
no
began
way
to
we're
move
talking about the
slowly
shark,
through the
the
rest.
Like,
As
what?
I've already mentioned, Tempe usually stopped me when I made the slightest mistake in the K-10. So when I reached the 12th position without interruption, I felt rather smug. Then, I misplaced my foot badly in Grandmother Gathers. When Vachette said nothing, I realized she was merely watching and withholding judgment until the end. I began to sweat and didn't stop until I reached the end of the K-10 10 minutes later. After I'd finished, Vachette stood stroking her chin.
I'm simply just
Well,
getting amazed right now.
She said slowly. It certainly could be worse. I felt a flicker of pride until she continued.
There's
You
too many people in
could,
there.
for instance, be missing a leg.
Have you seen her?
Then she walked in a circle around me, looking me up and down.
Fish, my guy.
She reached out to prod at my chest and stomach. She gripped at my upper arm and the thick muscle above my leg. I felt like a suckling pig brought to
and
market.
She wasn't even a princess.
Lastly, she took hold of my
It's just
hands,
a fucking
turning them
fish.
over to examine them. She looked pleasantly surprised. You never fought before Tempe taught you? She asked. I shook my head. You have good hands, she said, her fingers running up my forearms, feeling at the muscles there. Half of you barbarians have soft, weak hands from doing nothing. The other half have strong, stiff hands from cutting wood or working behind a plow. She turned my hands over in her own. But you have strong, clever hands with good motion in your wrists. She looked up at me questioningly. What do you do for a living? I'm a student at the university where I work with fine tools, shaping metal and stone, I explained.
Low-key
But
Jasmine's
I'm
fine.
also a musician.
This is pretty-
I play the
pretty up
lute.
there.
Vachette looked startled, then
Wasn't
burst
even-
into laughter. She let my hands fall and shook her head in dismay.
Oh my god.
A musician on top of everything else, she said.
And then there's
Perfect.
The,
Does anyone else know?
and then there's the.
What does
the-
it matter?
the
I
Atlantis
said.
one.
I'm not ashamed of who I am. No, she said. Of course you're not. That's part of the problem. She drew in a deep breath and let it out again. Okay. You should know about this as soon as possible. It will save us both trouble in the long run.
Alone on that one.
She looked me in the eye. You're a whore. I blinked.
Kita, who the fuck is that?
I beg your
The Atlantis
pardon?
princess is Kita?
Pay
Oh.
attention for a moment.
Well, she's a
You're not
fatty.
thick. You must have realized
She's
there are
probably number
huge
one.
cultural differences between here
Number
and
two's
where
probably
you grew
Jasmine.
up in
Then the number 3
the Commonwealth,
is,
I said. And you're right. The cultural divide between Tempe and
3 is,
myself was huge
probably-
compared to the other mercenaries from Vintus. She nodded.
Pocahontas.
Part of that is because Tempe has fewer
After that-
wits than
oh,
tits,
oh,
she said.
bitch.
And he is as
You
fresh
got
as a baby
so-
chick when it comes to making
Oh my
his
God, I
way
hate
in the
people that
world.
punch in pubs. You
She waved a
just-
hand. All that aside, you're
And
right.
Why when people
There are
punch
huge
once, do they feel the need
differences.
to punch 4 more times?
I noticed, I said. You don't seem to have a nudity taboo for one thing.
You are a
Either that
pussy.
or Tempe is a bit of an exhibitionist. I'd be curious how you found that out.
I swear this
She
guy's gonna
chuckled.
take this shit after me.
But
Make
you're
sure of
right.
that.
Strange as it may seem to
Told you.
you,
I told you
we
this
have
guy's
no
gonna take this shit
particular
out of me.
fear of a naked
Get a
body.
load of this fucking guy.
Vachette looked
There's a
thoughtful
whole
for a
squadron
moment,
in there.
then seemed to
We should
reach
be
some
so
kind of
mad.
decision. Here. It will be simpler to show you. Watch. I watched the familiar Adam impassivity slide over her face, leaving her face blank as new paper.
Bitch.
Her voice lost most of its inflection at the same time, shedding its emotional content. Tell me what I mean when I do this, she said. Vachette stepped close, making no eye contact. Her hand said, respect. You fight like a tiger. Her face was expressionless, her voice
I
flat
was
and
just
calm.
about to say, where's
She
this
grabbed
guy?
hold of the top of my shoulder with one hand and gripped my arm with the other, giving it a
Yeah.
squeeze. It's a
there.
compliment, I said. Vachette nodded and stepped back. Then she changed. Her face grew animated.
Princess
She
Peach.
smiled and met my
You know
eyes.
my thoughts on
She
Princess
stepped
Peach.
close to me. You fight like a tiger, she said, her voice glowing with admiration. One of her hands rested on the top of my
Not a
shoulder,
dark
while the
patch.
other slipped around my biceps. She squeezed. I was suddenly embarrassed at how close we were standing. It's a sexual advance, I said. Vachette stepped away and nodded. Your folk view certain things as intimate. Naked skin, physical contact, the nearness of a body, love play. To the Adem, these are nothing remarkable. She looked me in the eye. Can you think of a single time you have heard one of us shout, raise our voice, or even speak loudly enough we can be overheard? I thought for a moment, then shook my head.
What, football?
That is because for us, speaking is private, intimate. Facial expression, too. And this? She pressed her fingers to her throat. The warmth a voice can make, the emotion it reveals, that is a very private thing. And nothing carries more emotion than music, I said, understanding. It was a thought too strange for me to cope with all at once. Vashette nodded gravely. A family might sing together if they are close. A mother might sing to her child. A woman might sing to her man. A slight flush rose on Vachette's cheeks as she said this. But only if they are very much in love and very much alone. But you? She gestured to me. A musician? You do this to a whole room full of people, all at once. And for what? A few pennies? The price of a meal? She gave me a grave look. And you do it again and again, night after night, with anyone. Vachette shook her head in dismay and shuddered a bit, while her left hand unconsciously clenched in rough gestures, horror, disgust, rebuke. It was rather intimidating getting both sets of emotional signals from her at the same time. I fought off the mental image of standing naked on the stage of the Aeolian, then moving through the crowd, pressing my body to everyone there, young and old, fat and thin, rich noble and penniless commoner. It was a sobering thought. But play lute is the 38th position in the K-10, I protested. I was grasping at straws, and I knew it. And Sleeping Bear is 12th, she shrugged. But you will find no bears here, or lions, or lutes. Some names reveal. The names in the K-10 are meant to hide the truth, that we may speak of it without spilling its secrets to the open air.
Why are you flesh?
I understand, I said at last.
Sick in this guy.
But many of you have been out in the world. You yourself speak a turn beautifully and with much warmth in your voice. Surely you know there is nothing inherently wrong with a person singing.
I know that guy.
You have been out in the world as well, she said calmly. And surely you know there is nothing inherently wrong with having sex with 3 people in a row on the broad hearth of a busy inn. She looked me in the eye pointedly. I imagine the stone would be rather rough, I said. She chuckled. Very well. Assume they had use of a blanket, too. What would you call that person? If she'd asked me 2 span ago, when I'd been fresh out of the Fae, I might not have understood her. If I'd stayed with Felurian any longer, it's entirely possible that having sex on the hearth wouldn't have seemed odd to me. But I'd been back in the mortal world for a while now. A whore, I thought silently to myself. And a cheap and shameless whore to boot. I was glad I hadn't mentioned Tempe's desire to learn the lute to anyone. How ashamed he must have felt for such an innocent impulse. I thought of a young Tempe wanting to make music but never telling anyone because he knew it was dirty. It broke my heart. My face must have given away quite a bit because Vachette reached out to grip my hand gently. I know this is hard for you folk to understand. So much harder because you have never even entertained the possibility of thinking otherwise. Caution. I struggled with everything this implied. How do you get your news? I asked. With no troopers wandering from town to town, how do you keep in touch with the outside world? Vachette smirked a bit at this, and made a gesture to the wind-swept landscape. Does this seem to be a place that concerns itself overmuch with the turning of the world? She dropped her arm. But it is not so bad as you think. Traveling peddlers are more welcome here than in most places. Tinkers doubly so. And we ourselves travel quite a bit. Those who take the red come and go, bringing news with them. She laid a reassuring hand on my shoulder. And occasionally, a rare singer or musician will travel through. But they do not play for a whole town at once. They will visit a single family. Even then, they perform while sitting behind a screen so they cannot be seen. You can tell an ADEM musician because when they travel, they carry their tall screens on their backs. Her mouth pursed a bit.
Real name?
But even these are not viewed in an entirely favorable light. It is a valuable occupation, but not a respectable one. I relaxed a bit. The thought of a place where no performer was welcome struck me as profoundly wrong, sick even. But a place with strange customs I could understand. Adapting to fit your audience is common as changing costumes to the Ademaru. Vachette continued. This is the way of things, and you would do well to accept it sooner rather than later. I say this as a well-traveled woman. I've spent 8 years among the barbarians. I have even listened to music in a group of people. She said this proudly with a defiant tilt to her head. I have done it more than once. Have you ever sung in public? I asked. Vachette's face went stony. That is not a polite question to ask, she said stiffly, and you will make no friends with it here. All I mean, I said quickly, is that if you tried it, you might find it is nothing shameful. It is a great joy to everyone. Vachette gave me a severe look and made a hard gesture of refusal and finality.
Shorts on too, low-key.
Quoth, I have traveled much and seen much. Many of the ADEM here are worldly. We know of musicians, and to be completely forthright, many of us have a secret guilty fascination with them.
What the fuck?
Much the same way your folk are enamored with the skill of the Modegan courtesans. She gave me a hard look. But for all that, I would not want my daughter to bring one home, if you catch my meaning. Neither would it improve anyone's opinion of Tempe if others knew he had shared the Khaitan with such as you. Keep it to yourself. You have enough to overcome without all Edemre knowing you are a musician on top of everything. Chapter 114. His Sharp and Single Arrow. Reluctantly, I took Vachette's advice, and though my fingers itched for it, I did not bring out my lute that night and fill my small corner of the school with music. I even went so far as to slide my lute case underneath my bed, lest the mere sight of it fill the school with rumor. For several days, I did little but study under Vachette. I ate alone and made no attempt to speak with anyone, as I was suddenly self-conscious of my language. Carceret kept her distance, but she was always there, watching me, her eyes flat and angry as a snake's. I took advantage of Vachette's excellent Turin and asked 1,000 questions that would have been too subtle for Tempe to understand. I waited 3 entire days until I asked her the question that had been slowly smoldering inside me since I'd climbed the foothill of the storm wall. Personally, I thought this showed exceptional restraint. Vachette, I asked, do your people have stories of the Chandrian? She looked at me, her normally expressive face gone suddenly impassive. And what does this have to do with your hand talk?
This shit's crazy.
Her hand flickered through several different variations of the gesture that indicated disapproval and reproach.
64 hours.
Nothing, I said. Does it have something to do with your fighting, then?
What the
she
fuck?
asked.
Why is this so good?
No, I admitted, but surely it relates to the Khaitan, Vachette said, or the Lethani. Or perhaps it touches on some subtle shade of meaning you have difficulty grasping in Adamic. I am merely curious. Vachette sighed. Can I persuade you to focus your curiosity on more pressing matters? She asked, gesturing, exasperated, firm rebuke. I quickly let the matter drop. Not only was Vachette my teacher, she was my only companion. The last thing I wanted to do was irritate her, or give the impression that I was less than attentive to her lessons. With that one disappointing exception, Vachette was a sparkling font of information. She answered my endless questions quickly and clearly. As a result, I couldn't help but feel that my skill in speaking and fighting was progressing in great leaps and bounds. Vachette did not share my enthusiasm, and was not bashful about saying so, eloquently, in 2 languages. Vachette and I were down in the hidden valley that contained the sword tree. We had been practicing our hand fighting for about an hour, and were now sitting in the long grass, catching our breath. Rather, I was catching my breath. Vachette was not winded at all. Fighting me was nothing to her, and there was no time when she couldn't chide me for sloppiness or reaching lazily past my defenses to cuff me on the side of the head.
Which song is this?
Vachette,
Oh, hit it.
I said, mustering the courage to ask a question that had been bothering me for some time.
Everybody was like dirty.
May I ask a question that is perhaps presumptuous?
I'm telling you,
I
every
prefer a
single
presumptuous
song on here is like a
student,
banger.
she said. I had hoped we were beyond the point of worrying about such things. What is the purpose of all this? I gestured between the two of us. The purpose of this, she mimicked my gesture, is to teach you enough so that you no longer fight like a little boy drunk on his mother's wine. Today, her sandy hair was tied in 2 short braids that hung down her back on either side of her neck. This made her look oddly girlish, and had not done wonders for my self-esteem over the last hour as she had repeatedly thrown me to the ground, forced me into submission, and struck me with countless solid but generously pulled punches and kicks. And once, laughing, she had stepped easily behind me and slapped me firmly on the ass, as if she were a lecherous taproom drunk and I some low-bodiced serving girl.
Fire, basically.
But why? I asked. To what purpose are you teaching me? If Tempe was wrong to teach me, why continue to teach me more? Vachette nodded approvingly. I've been wondering how long it would take you to ask that, she said. It should have been one of your first questions. I've been told I ask too many questions, I said. I've been trying to step a little more carefully here.
Yeah, I put it in chat.
Vachette sat forward, suddenly businesslike. You know things you should not. Cheyenne does not mind that you know of the Lethani, though others feel differently, but there is agreement on the subject of our K-10. It is not for barbarians. It is only for the Adem, and only for those who follow the path of the sword tree. Vachette continued. Cheyenne's thought is thus. If you were part of the school, you would be part of Ademre. If you are part of Ademre, you are no longer a barbarian. And if you are no longer a barbarian, it would not be wrong for you to know these things. It had a certain convoluted logic to it. That also means Tempe would not be wrong for teaching me. She nodded. Exactly.
I don't even know any
Instead
of
of bringing
these songs,
home an
but I'm
unwanted
banging.
puppy,
They're
it
all
would be
bangers.
as if he had returned a lost lamb to the
Probably be a
fold.
banger too.
Must I be a lamb or a puppy? I sighed. It's undignified. You fight as a puppy
Not as much
fights,
of a headbanger,
she
but
said,
it's fire.
eager and clumsy. But aren't I already part of the school? I asked. You are teaching me, after all. Vachette shook her head. You sleep in the school and eat our food, but that does not make you a student. Many children study the K-10 with hopes of entering the school and someday wearing the red. They live and study with us. They are in the school, but not of the school,
Dude,
if you follow me.
64 hours worth of bangers.
It seems odd to me that so many want to become mercenaries, I said as gently as possible.
I don't like dubstep.
You seem eager enough, she said with an edge to her voice. I am eager to learn, I said, not take the life of a mercenary. I mean no offense. Vachette stretched her neck, working out some stiffness. It is your language getting in the way. In the barbarian lands, mercenaries are the lowest rung of society. No matter how thick or useless a man might be, he can carry a cudgel and earn a halfpenny a day guarding a caravan. Am I right? The lifestyle does tend to attract a rough sort of person, I said. We are not mercenaries of that kind. We are paid, but we choose which jobs we take. She paused. If you fight for your purse, you're a mercenary. What are you called if you fight out of duty for your country? A soldier. If you fight for the law, a constable,
Dude,
or a bailiff.
What do you mean? That's not a banger.
If you fight for your reputation,
I
had to think a bit on that one.
Come on, bro.
a duelist, perhaps?
I can't hear the game.
If you fight for the good of
But it's a
others.
banger.
An
You're telling
emir,
me that this won't,
I said
like,
without thinking.
This won't get your heart pumping a little
She
bit?
cocked her head at me.
No?
That is an interesting
This shit's
choice,
this
she
shit's
said.
fire.
Vashat held up her
like,
arm, displaying the red sleeve
BPM's
proudly.
gotta it's gotta be like close
We
to your
Adem
heart
are
rate or
paid to
some shit,
guard,
'cause
to hunt, to
this
protect.
shit just bang.
We fight for our land and our school and our reputations. And we fight for the Lethani. With the Lethani. In the Lethani. All of these things together. The Adem word for one who takes the red is Satan. She looked up at me. And it is a very proud thing. So, becoming a mercenary is quite high on the Adem social ladder, I said. She nodded. But barbarians do not know this word, and wouldn't understand even if they did. So, mercenary must suffice. Vashat pulled 2 long strands of grass from the ground and began to twist them together into a cord. This is why Cheyenne's decision is not an easy one to
there's people
make.
shooting. I didn't
She
know
must balance what is right against what is best for her school, all the while taking into consideration the good of the entire
no,
path
bro,
of the
that
sword
shit's-
tree. Rather than make a rash
fire.
decision, she is playing a more patient game.
Oh, there's nobody dead.
Personally, I think she is hoping the problem will take care of itself. How would this take care of itself? I asked. You could have run off,
Come on.
she said simply. Many assumed you would. If I'd decided you were not worth teaching, that would have taken it out of her hands as well. Or you could die during your training, or become crippled. I stared at her. She shrugged. Accidents happen. Not often, but sometimes. If Carceret had been your teacher... I grimaced.
EDM is just different.
So, how does one officially become a member of the school?
EDM on, like, my free time,
Is
but,
there
like,
some
I
sort
don't
of
know.
test?
This playlist is...
She shook her head. First, someone must stand on your behalf, saying you are worthy of joining the school.
Hush.
Tempe? I asked. Someone of consequence,
Interesting way to
she
say that.
clarified. So that would be you, I said slowly. Vashet grinned, tapping the side of her crimped nose, then pointing at me. Only took you 2
Where did my
guesses.
shoe go, man?
If you ever progress to the point I feel you won't embarrass me, I'll stand on your behalf, and you can take the test.
Dude. What the fuck is going on in my chat right now?
Do I take a beacon? In case?
A beacon? Oh, a mobile. You guys are stressing Louise out. Oh, you shouldn't have shot him.
You got it like 60?
Yeah. This guy's in